G'day folks, it's Rob Tibbings from ECT for Health, and you're back with another episode of Ectopics. So this week, or this month, April 2021, is National Autism Month. And you've probably heard quite a lot on the radio. Certainly ABC have been running a number of interviews with experts on autism. And one of the interviewers that I've been listening to on ABC radio is David Iliffe. Now, David Iliffe not only is an accomplished radio speaker and announcer who runs a successful breakfast program in southern Queensland, but he's also a personal friend of mine. And he joins me today to talk about his journey with his boys with autism. So a dirty little secret of mine is that about 10 years ago, I reached out to a friend of mine who, like my wife and I, had children on the spectrum, the autistic spectrum. And he said, "Hey, Rob, are you interested in doing something really crazy? Are you interested in doing a 40-kilometre walk?" Now, those that know me know that walking isn't my forte, but I said, yeah, why not? One thing led to another. We did a bit of training, and ultimately a 40-kilometre walk to raise money for autism took place. I mixed it up a little bit. I did that 40-kilometre walk in a dress. It was one of those island dresses that they wear up in the Torres Strait, but that's a whole nother story. That friend of mine is David Iliffe, and he joins me today. David, welcome to Ectopics.
G'day, Rob. It is a pleasure to join you, and I have vivid memories of you doing that walk in the dress, and it was hard enough, because it was 40 kilometres, but whenever it felt like it was getting a little bit too hard, I'd just look over to you and think, well, at least I didn't decide to do it in a dress. Yeah,
and I guess there's a long story around that. The long story short is that it was one of those fundraising sort of excursions where you got sponsored by people, and when I put it out to the internet, I had a number of followers and colleagues and friends that said, why don't you mix it up a bit and wear some sort of a crazy costume? And I said, okay, well, those that donate the largest amount, the person who donates the largest amount gets to choose exactly what I'm going to wear. And so it was a bit of a head-to-head with two friends of mine. One that said I should wear Borat's mankini, and the other said I should wear an island dress from the Torres Strait. And I'm so thankful that the person who suggested that I wear the island dress from the Torres Strait was the victor, because it was, if I recall, it was in the middle of May or the very, very beginning of, no, it might have even been April. It was April, wasn't it? Because it was
certainly, there was a chill in the air, put it that way. Yes.
It was a chill in the air, and the last thing I wanted to do was have to wear Borat's mankini. Nobody wanted to see that.
I mean, think about it though. It could have been a fundraiser in terms of people might have thrown money at you to actually put your clothes back on. So you might have just, been able to add a little bit of sweetener to it.
I had pictures of people putting a $5 note in the straps of the mankini, but that's we digress. David, it's Autism Month.
It is indeed, and as someone who works in the media, I've been looking at different ways of broaching this topic on my own program. So I am well aware, yes, indeed, and it's good. It's good to have a month that actually raises awareness about a condition that I think a lot of people think they know about, but probably when you get down to the nitty gritty, don't know all that much about at all.
David, you and I have both lived with children on the spectrum since their birth. How old are your boys?
My boys, my oldest now is 16, just about 17. In fact, he'll be able to tell you, to the days and hours how long till he's 17, because he's the obligatory, excitement over being able to drive solo. And the other is 15. So there's 18 months between my two boys.
So we first met when your boys were really small. Actually, they were probably only about 4 or 5 when we first met. So we go back a fair way, David, and a lot of water has gone under the bridge. When we first met each other, we discovered that we both had kids on the spectrum. Mine are a little bit older than yours are. I've got a 19-year-old who's just turned 19, and my oldest is 26. So we certainly have a little bit more water under the bridge average in that regard. But I remember when we first reached out to each other, just as a couple of blokes who lived in Toowoomba with kids on the spectrum, and to raise money for the ABC Learning Centre, wasn't it? Was it ABC?
That's right. It was AEIOU. Yeah, and they're still.
I got my letters wrong.
Yes. Luckily, grammar wasn't a condition of being able to put your kids in there. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gone all that well either. It does stand for something that they've sort of stretched it around to make it fit. But it's a catchy name, that's for sure.
It is certainly a catchy name. That's right. The AEIOU Learning Centre, which was a learning centre for children who were on the spectrum, and as a dad who had kids that were diagnosed on the spectrum, and I guess you probably reflect on this yourself, it was a real whirlwind of trying to figure out, well, what does that even mean? Does that mean my son, at the time it was my son, but, does it mean that my son is autistic, and, how will he function, and how will he turn into a functioning member of society and an adult, and what does that mean for his mother and I, and what does that mean for his ability to be able to have all the same opportunities that a child that was neurotypically normal, if I can use that term, and I felt, personally, I felt a little bit like I was unprepared, that I should, as a nurse, have a little bit more of an understanding. Now, 10 years on, David, my colleagues, nurses, most of whom are nurses that are listening to our podcast, most nurses really don't have a great understanding of what it means to be on the autistic spectrum, what Asperger's syndrome is, or Asperger's, depending on your pronunciation, what autism is. And I guess I wanted to reach out to you because in your role in interviewing people on from all walks of life, I certainly know that you've had some amazing interviews with some amazing people who are very much experts in the area. And I guess I wanted to pick your brains from that point of view, and also pick your brains on what it's like to be a dad, watching boys, certainly for the last 10 years, go from pre-teen and now through that tumultuous time of their teen years on the spectrum, and what that means for you and Karen as a dad. The other place that I wanted to take our little chat was when you take your boys to a hospital or to a health clinic where they're going to interact with healthcare professionals who clearly don't have a great understanding of what it means to be on the spectrum. What advice could you give them if you could have a captive audience like you do right now? So I think that's a big place to start. We're not one size fits all, but neither
it is, but it's an interesting one because, as I sort of mentioned earlier, and as you've alluded to there too, that it is a condition, autism, that is now, and really in the last 20 years, has just the awareness of the condition, not of what the condition actually entails and the nitty-gritty of it, but the awareness of the condition and a really rudimentary knowledge of it has increased just incredibly so. I mean, certainly when, you and I went to school, I think the term was there, autism. We'd never heard of Asperger's, and everyone just put autism, I think, in the same boat as any other, disability, or we might have perceived it as a mental disability. So in that time between when you and I went to school and now, it's become commonplace. So most people have heard of it, which is a hell of a head start. But there is still, and it intrigues me. It's always been one of the most amazing things, I think, on Karen's and my journey with our two kids, is that even within the medical profession, people you would assume would be completely across it because it is a medical condition and you're a medical professional, so you should know about this. But that's just not the case. So it's well known, but it's still on the outer to the point that it's not compulsory learning unless you're studying to be a paediatrician. But as my understanding of it, and I may stand corrected here, Rob, if you want, but my understanding of it is that if you're studying to be a doctor or a nurse, unless you're going to specialise in paediatrics, or unless you're going to specialise in neuro disorders or behavioural disorders or anything, you won't learn anything more than a real surface sort of coverage of what autism means and what it means to be autistic. But it's important because for someone with autism, going into an emergency department of a hospital or even going to the doctors can be a really confronting experience. And I think just a little bit of knowledge about what that could mean would go a long way, without a doubt. The hard thing, I think, about talking about it or coming up with any tips is that the first thing that I think most people need to know about autism is that it's not like other conditions where you can say, if you have leukemia or if you have some sort of cancer, well, your symptoms will be this, this, and this, and it may differ as to how advanced it is. It may differ as to how it can be treated. It may differ as to how aggressive it is, but these are the symptoms and they're all fairly predictable, and you can see where it's going to go. Whereas autism, no matter where a child is on the spectrum, for a start, it's a spectrum. So the huge number of different levels of autism that a child can have. And our two, and certainly your kids, Rob, high functioning autism, which means for a start that they can communicate, they can read, they can look after themselves. You'll notice quirky things about them, but they're able to function in society. But then if you're further down the spectrum, there can be characteristics that will stop you living a normal life. So there's a huge spectrum. But even amongst high functioning kids and adults, there's a huge range of different symptoms and different ways that it will manifest itself. So it's very hard to warn against or to give tips because they won't apply to all. But I think there is a universal what people in the medical profession, particularly in emergency department, need to be aware is that kids with on the spectrum will they're very sensory driven, so their senses are often heightened. So to go into an emergency department where there's signs everywhere and there might be someone screaming or crying and there might be someone getting angry because they've waited for so long and the doors are opening all the time and then they close and they don't know where those doors lead, but every time they open they get a little bit more of a look into what's on that other side, and people come out. Some people are wearing masks and some people have got devices around their neck that look a little bit scary, and there might be a PA announcement or there might be someone getting something from the vending machine and that's loud and, oh gee, I'd like a drink. There's so much going on that it can build up their stress levels to a height that unless you're aware of it you wouldn't fully appreciate. So I think that's probably the big one, is to just be aware that kids with autism will be perceiving an already scary or imposing experience. It will be magnified 10 or 20 or 30-fold for a child on the spectrum.
Sure. David, you round it so beautifully. I'd like to actually focus on perhaps one of the more frightening manifestations, both as a parent but also as a caregiver, as a nurse who, my background is emergency, and so as a nurse who works in an emergency environment, when somebody does come in and is decompensating in front of us. So we might refer to it as a decompensation. I think as a dad of children on the spectrum, the term meltdown is often thrown around. Do you find that an offensive term, a meltdown? Is it a term? No.
No, look, and some might, some parents might. I think it's an accurate description because it really is the case. It's a bit like what's happening inside a child with autism it's a bit like a nuclear reactor melting down. It's too much input and too much heat and too much stimulus, and they literally are saying, no, can't cope. So to preserve my sanity or my physical health, I'm just going to shut down and melt down, and I'm going to let off some of this steam. And that's exactly what it is, really.
David, do you see meltdowns coming in your experience? can you preempt them? Are there some, I guess what I'm looking for is if I was to be caring for somebody on the spectrum in my department and the sensory overload, and it really is that, the sensory overload is starting to build. We see behavioural changes in people who are coping with the stressors of sensory overload. How would you advise a nurse or a doctor would identify that a meltdown is imminent?
I think it's not with kids with autism, and again, they're all different, but I think it's not like an adult or a neurotypical child or adult where you can see if someone's getting agitated and you can see, that almost proverbial steam coming out of their ears. It doesn't necessarily follow suit. Often with a child on the spectrum, they can be approaching a meltdown and appear to be fairly normal, but there's often one telltale sign is that the child will walk around on tippy toes, like literally be walking in a way that just seems uncomfortable, but just means that it's a sign that their body is so rigid because they're so on edge, and their fingers might be sort of playing with their fingers and running through their fingers by extending the joints and making the joints click and little things like that. And often children on the autism spectrum who are approaching a meltdown will appear sort of very almost glazed over, as if they're sort of in a trance. That's a sign that something's coming up. But see, it's hard in an emergency situation, like an emergency ward at the hospital or emergency intake. It's hard because the doctors and nurses also are working under tight deadlines, and they're under a high stress situation, and I suppose they can only give so much extra treatment or special treatment to any one patient because they've got to churn through them. I always think that it's better just if nurses who are listening could just be aware. These days it's so easy, even if it's not in your training, before you get into the profession or as you're going through, it's so easy these days to do research and to read up on a condition. And we talked about AEIOU before, and they, as well as being an early intervention centre for kids with autism, they're also now, their website is a receptacle for a lot of just really well told, well explained, in layman's terms, information about the condition. And there are, I believe, I'm told the last time I went out there to do a story, there are videos there that show parents, how to deal with meltdowns. There are videos there where kids talk about what it's like to actually be on the spectrum, and teenagers talk about it. And then adults who are on there talking about what it's like to grow up with autism and what they've learned to cope with. And as well as that, YouTube is full of people who are talking about exactly what you and I are talking about. This is what it feels like to have a meltdown. This is the aspects of everyday life that, even though I appear to be coping on the surface, that I find the hardest to deal with. Thank God for social media and things like YouTube, because as much as we criticize them, it has allowed people to have a voice and to describe situations that otherwise nurses and trainee doctors and the like would have had to go through 20-year-old medical books to try and find this sort of information. But here it's out there and it's current. Just got to do some research, I think.
And I guess that, you make a very, very good point. And with the busyness in life, healthcare professionals having to maintain their skills and their knowledge, and we call it continuous professional development, CPD, is certainly a requirement of our licensing every year. Personally, I'll be honest with you, I haven't spent a lot of time or a lot of effort playing in education in that space. So what we will do is we will definitely put some links up for some really good educational websites around that for our colleagues, and we'll link that to the Ectopics podcast here. David, tell me about stigma. Have you experienced stigma with your boys?
So people sort of openly being changing their way of relating to the kids when they find out they have autism. You mean essentially?
Perhaps, yeah, or even just demonstrating blatant ignorance where where you felt that, wow, where did that come from? Where did that perception, where did that stereotype come from? I mean, there is portrayal of people on the spectrum, certainly in popular press. And I know I'm moving towards the space that is really your area, and that is media. There is some media portrayal of autism, and sometimes that's based on some very heartfelt stereotypes of children who are autistic or adults who are autistic. How is that portrayal in the media? How close is that to reality, do you think?
I think it is actually getting better, and it's really quite interesting because just recently, I don't know if you read, but it's becoming more acceptable, socially acceptable, because there are two levels. Firstly, on a reality level, more people are coming out and saying, yes, I recognise that I am on the spectrum. And an example of that recently is the comedian Josh Thomas, the kid who's been on various ABC things. It looks like he's about 10, but is really 25. And he's quite funny. But he's come out recently and said, I've realised that I'm on the spectrum and have been all my life. And I can't remember what the trigger was, but he's been very open about that. And when you see him perform, or you see him even acting in some of the shows that he's acted in, I think it does come out. But I think that sort of thing is terrific. But I guess if you're talking about how, Hollywood and how, the media that's creating manufactured drama treats autism, I think that is improving as well. Because we've come a long way. And I think one of the great stereotypes that people always fell back on for a long time when it came to autism was Rain Man. So there's always that. Absolutely.
And it's I reckon I was actually going with a more modern portrayal in a series that I've actually got into watching fairly recently called The Good Doctor.
Yes. Well, interesting one. Because, I was going to say, Rain Man is one depiction, but it did tend to give a lot of people the impression that if they came across anyone on the spectrum, they would have this photographic memory. They would get pure joy out of reading the phone book. They'd be able to count cards and possibly win you $1 million. And, maybe you should have hung around this person more because it could pay off. But it was a very, very narrow view. I know of people on the spectrum who I haven't met anyone like Dustin Hoffman's character in Rain Man, but obviously they do exist, that savant ability, but also extremely socially inept. So I would say someone like his character, I can't remember his first name in Rain Man, but he would be considered low functioning.
Sure.
But you mentioned The Good Doctor, and there's another show that I think there's only been about 3 series, but I thought it was terrific, called Atypical, which I think was on
Yes,
on
that was the
Netflix.
other one I was going to go with, yeah.
Yeah, really, really good depiction. I think that kid probably comes the closest to that. If there's anything typical about kids on the spectrum, teenagers on the spectrum, that we've come across with our kids and with friends of our kids and people in our circle, that main character in that series, who's a teenager, grappling with all the challenges of high school, but also realizing he's got autism and the bullying and the taking things literally and the being taken advantage of, but also, appreciating, developing slowly some wisdom about, who's trying to use him and who's not, is so accurate. It's done really, really well. And The Good Doctor is actually a really good example as well, because he is, he's very much on the spectrum, but the brilliance comes out, but also his naivety, and it comes out in that show how a lot of the public just aren't comfortable dealing with him because they just don't know. It's like he's from a different planet, but then they appreciate his brilliance. And I think that's often something that adults on the spectrum do wrestle with. So it is getting better. We've come a long way from Rain Man, I think.
Dave, a very personal question now.
Sure.
Not that anyone's listening. But do you think you're on the spectrum?
I would have absolutely no doubt. Rob, without a doubt. And that's an interesting thing too, because...
And I'm sorry to have to be so personal about it, but I guess it's actually just a reflection, because I think a lot of parents find that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And when their children are diagnosed or ascertained, or whatever the correct terminology is these days, I think only then does the parent really realise that one or both of the parents are probably also on the spectrum as well.
Without a doubt. And I think, again, it's a very broad spectrum, but this has been really interesting for me, because when I was growing up, I didn't, autism was virtually unknown, and certainly Asperger's and any sort of knowledge about high functioning and low functioning of the different types or the different levels and how broad the spectrum is was just unknown certainly by kids and adults, unknown outside the medical profession. But I look back when my kids were diagnosed, I look back and see a lot of similarities and things that I used to do as a kid that would just be an absolute, I was going to say red flag, but that indicates a terrible warning, and I think there's negativity with that it probably doesn't deserve. But there would have been shall we say, markers that would have been fairly obvious now that my parents just wouldn't have even picked up. So I used to spend hours in my room playing with matchbox cars, but not setting up a road system. I mean, I'd do that as well and have a bit of imagination. But my brother and sister used to tease me relentlessly because I would just push. I'd like a certain movement, so I'd push the car back and forth over that same bit of ground again and again and again, and that repetition. And, a dead giveaway of potential autism there. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not normal behaviour. It's slightly obsessive behaviour,
It's atypical. It's exactly what we've been talking about. It's not that it's socially unacceptable. It's just different.
That's right. Yeah. And I also remember when I was a teenager, and this is where I feel like I was so blessed to fall in with a group of friends who I just clicked with, and they were terrific, and that made my high school 5 years just a dream run compared to other kids I know. But I consider myself so lucky that with that close group of friends, probably a lot of my more Aspergian traits were probably masked or accepted or just nothing, not even thought anything of. But if I hadn't fallen in with that group of friends, I think it would have been more obvious for me at high school. But I do remember on the more serious side, first girlfriend in high school in grade 10, I went out with this girl who I still keep in touch with now, which is great that we're still friends. But for Jenny was her name, we went out for over a year, and when it broke up, I was so devastated. And I look back on that and think that was definitely a sign. How I coped with that and what my expectations were of that relationship, and thus my inability to accept that it was over, are definitely autistic traits. There is absolutely no doubt about it. It was shattering because I just thought, we're together, we're always going to be together. That's it.
That's
nothing
exactly
will split us up. And, there's nothing wrong here. What do you mean there's something wrong? We get along great, we go on great dates, and just so black and white that that to me was definitely a marker, shall we say.
We were told with one of ours on diagnosis that your child will never play with other kids. They'll play alongside other kids.
Yep.
How do you process that? It felt inflammatory when that was said. They will never play with other children. They'll always play alongside other children. And when I stop and I reflect back on the kids that I've had and the kids that I've known that are on the spectrum, I think there's a lot of truth. As difficult as that was to hear, there's a lot of truth in that. And it really does come back to the very, very guts of what autism means. It's that introspective type play.
Absolutely, but it's funny because that and that must be somewhere in a textbook, that they give pediatricians to use as a way of sort of demystifying what your child has and how it's going to show itself over the years. Because I've heard that, and in fact, I remember the day that James, our oldest, was diagnosed, and my wife went along to the appointment, and we didn't really have any real indication that this was the appointment where we were going to be given news like this, so I didn't go. And I ordinarily would have, but I didn't go. And she rang me and told me. And give me half a second.
Okay, mate. Take a second.
But so I didn't know anything about what autism was really, no more than I knew as a teenager. But as luck would have it, I was going in.
It's all right, David. Take a minute.
I'm good. I was going into hospital that night to do a sleep study to see why I snored so much. And the person who was doing the sleep study was a medical student, something that they did to earn a bit of extra money. It was good penalty rates overnight. And so I told him the news that we'd heard, and what do you know about this autism thing? And he said, and it's sort of an example of what we were saying before, that unless you're studying the right field of medicine, you won't know much, even if you're studying medicine. And he just pulled out one of the books that he bought in to study and said, oh, look, all I've really got on it is this. And there was that paragraph, this very brief summary of what autism was, but the last paragraph was, you can fully expect your child to be lonely in the playground, or, loneliness is something that your child will wrestle with later in life. And it's sort of like, boom, that was like this awful prediction. And it hasn't really manifested itself quite in that way. Nothing ever does.
Not as black and white and as cold as what it could be written in a textbook.
No, that's right. And that's why I think perhaps doctors, and I'm sure doctors have a different approach, different pediatricians, but, perhaps emphasising that a little bit less and emphasising that, you will have to teach your children some of the social skills that most kids learn naturally. I think that would probably be the best approach, I think, yeah.
For sure. Fast forward on 10 years, you have a greater understanding of autism, and you've certainly rolled with the punches of it. Has there been medication in use with your boys? And if so, what sorts of medication are typical that you recall?
We've been, the medication is almost another story in itself. It's almost another chapter in the book. I know, and to be honest, and I'm almost a bit embarrassed to say this, but I have trouble sometimes keeping track of what medication my kids are on for, particularly my youngest, Benjamin, what medication he's on that is directly for the symptoms of his autism, and what is for things, because as you would know, and as a lot of parents with kids with autism are discovering, it usually comes hand in hand and coupled with other conditions such as ADHD and a lot of other sort of behavioural issues that aren't autism, but they just generally go together. And so my kids are on a lot of medication for things like ADHD and Tourette's, although not conventional Tourette's, just bursting into swearing words at the drop of a hat, but, and a host of other things. So, but all I can say is, be that as it may, medication is a godsend, really. And I don't quite understand, although I respect parents who say, look, I don't want my child to be on medication. I don't want them to be on a drug that is, mind altering or is going to adapt their behavior or dull their, some of the bright sparks of their personality. And I sort of understand that, but I also think that medication often is the difference between a child being able to go to school and not, and a child being able to go to Coles to shop for a half an hour and then go home and not have a meltdown because it's been sensory overload. And
Sure,
so medication can be the key between your child living a normal life and or not living a normal life. But it is quite confronting because some of the medication that you're prescribed comes with, I mean, it is antipsychotic medication, you know, and
Yes.
that has that stigma or all the connotations of just that word that makes you as a parent think, my child is only 6 years old. How on earth can he be going on to antipsychotic medication? You know, and it's just a term, but it's a very confronting term.
It is, and unfortunately, in the field of medicine, we tend to call, categorize drugs with names that are somewhat archaic. I mean, if we just look at that, another group of medications that are very, very common for kids and adults on the spectrum are antidepressants. And it's not because they're depressed. The vast majority of people on antidepressant medication are not on those medications for depression. Anxiety dominates the list of why somebody would be taking an antidepressant. If we should call them anything, we should be calling them anti-anxiety agents.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Or perhaps just a calming medication or something like that, you know.
Yes, but a calmative. That sounds a lot nicer, doesn't it? A calmative.
Let's start that campaign.
Let's start that campaign, David. See how that rolls, hey? See if we can change the conventions of medicine of what is it, 200 years or so.
That's exactly right. Absolutely. But I think, sorry, just to go back briefly, I don't want to dance all over the place, but I feel like when we were talking about the, your advice to nurses and to doctors, I feel like I didn't probably just sort of round that up. But really, I would say, just to reiterate, it really is incumbent on you to do your own research, knowing, because I spoke to an expert in autism very early on in the piece, and he made the point, and he was talking about exactly this, that medical professionals it's not obligatory to learn anything more than the most rudimentary aspects of autism as part of your training unless you specialise. But he made the point, and I don't want to say this to sound controversial or it's not racist in any way, but it was a very logical comparison he felt, and I feel as well, is that doctors, people who are working in the medical profession, who are dealing with the public, will have to do a certain degree of training on dealing with cultural sensitivities in dealing with Indigenous people. And so they should, and that's valuable and warranted, and no one would dispute it. But if you're going to make that compulsory in the training, then, and I couldn't tell you the odds, but we're talking at the moment that one in, gosh, you might know the stat, Rob, better than me. I haven't had to repeat this for a while, but, one in 100 people in Australia will be on the spectrum in some way or another. Does that sound about right? I mean, it's a very high proportion.
I think it's much higher than that. I mean, we're talking about, anxiety and depressive spectrum disorders make up about 20% of the population. 20%.
Yeah.
That's 1 in 5 people who work in your office will be on a mood spectrum disorder, something like anxiety. We call it the neurotic spectrum. So anxiety or depression. That's 1 in 5. So now link that with other syndromes like autism, and the spectrum's huge from high functioning through to very, very poorly functioning. The spectrum is huge. I would hazard a guess as to say it was greater than 1 in 100. Schizophrenia is less prevalent, and it's 2%. So I just wanted to pause there for a moment and chime in. 1 in 100, these stats that David has cited are certainly quite relevant, but those stats really come from about 2014. The current estimate is that diagnoses on the autism spectrum disorders rate to around about 1 in 70. 1 in 70. So that's about 1.5% of the population on that spectrum. Okay, back to the podcast.
Well, there you go. So, if the training for, cultural sensitivities when it comes to Indigenous people, completely warranted, I can't stress that enough. But if that is mandatory, and the statistics in terms of patients that you will treat who will be of Indigenous culture, where that training will come into play, the proportion is far higher of kids or adults who are somewhere on the spectrum, and yet that training is only an elective at best, or rudimentary. If you don't seek it out, so go and do the research yourself. Sometimes that's what you have to do, I suppose.
I think that's very, very salient advice, David. I really want to say thank you very much for coming on and being so candid and so honest. I'm sorry that we went to a dark place, but sometimes I think the interview style that I like to portray is very much where our listeners are just a fly on the wall with a couple of people having a conversation, and I really feel that we've been able to do that. A couple of dads of autistic kids. I think that's it's been a really heartwarming chat, and it's one that whenever we do catch up socially, we've never had. We've maybe right back in
you're right.
But it's not something where we've had an opportunity. So there we go. We've laid our conversation out in front of all of our listeners, and developed a little bit more of. I've developed a little bit more of an insight on you and you and Karen's journey, and the journey of your boys. So. From all of us here at ECT for Health and the Ectopics podcast, David Iliffe, I just want to say thank you so much for being so honest and upfront and agreeing to do this interview that wasn't meant to be medical. It was really just meant to be a bit of an experience to celebrate this. I really, really think that it's important that we need to discuss these conditions that we know very, very little about, and I couldn't think of a better time to do it than in this week that is our Autism Week and the Autism Month.
Absolutely. Look, no, an absolute pleasure. And, there are always some parts of the story that always sort of, choke me up, because obviously there is a lot of emotion involved, and that's almost another conversation for another day. That sort of a mourning period, which always sounds terrible when people say, well, if your child is diagnosed with autism or any condition of that nature, there is an adjustment to be made, and there is that sort of mourning period, and so that's almost another discussion. But I do think one thing that amazes me, if I can just say this in closing, and it still amazes me to this day, that the parents of kids with autism have to, by default, they have to get across the condition. They have to find out everything that they can about it. And obviously the age that we live in now with the internet makes that possible. But I'm staggered at the number of parents that I meet whose kids are on the spectrum, the amount of knowledge that they have. They can tell you every theory about, what causes autism and what doesn't, all the conspiracy theories and all the genuine medically proven theories. They can tell you about the solutions or the helps when it comes to diet and that sort of thing that they try that do work and what doesn't work, and they just become experts. And it just amazes me how much they can accumulate when you have to. And these are people that you would think, gosh, I can't even imagine them ever going to school or being in the classroom. And that, I'm not saying that to be snobby, but it's astounding how much information you can find and take in and hold in your head when you need to. And, which gets back again, I suppose, to, if parents who with no medical background can accrue this sort of level of expertise in one particular medical condition just by doing their research with the tools that they have available, then certainly medical professionals can do a little bit more just to know what it all means and to work out strategies for a type of patient that inevitably will, on a regular basis, come across their path.
Absolutely. Great advice, David. Again, thanks very much, David Iliffe. Thank you for talking to me. Thank you for talking to us on the Ectopics podcast. I'd love to get you back again and pick your brains on some other really, really interesting issues that I know our listeners would be very, very interested in hearing. So
always up for a chat, and this is the trouble when you get someone two people who are fit to talk for a living together, you can't shut them up.
What are you saying, David?
But I don't interpret that as a bad thing, though.
All righty. Again, thanks very much, David, and we will talk to you again. So there it is, folks. David Iliffe. David has a breakfast radio show on ABC Radio here in southern Queensland, and I have been an avid listener of his program for all of the years that we lived in Toowoomba, and that sort of stemmed to meeting at various events, and eventually striking up a friendship with a guy that I certainly have some things in common with. So. Well, that's pretty much it for our podcast today. A long one. I was going to chop it into 2 sessions, but if you're one of these people that just likes to put a podcast on for a nice long drive, then I guess you're probably still with us right till the end. So let us know in the comments what you thought about the interview, and I'm very, very happy to run some interviews based on your ideas. So get in touch with us. My name is Rob Timmings. You've been listening to Rob Timmings and David Iliffe on the Ectopics podcast, a podcast from ECT for Health for nurses.